I want to tackle the question of granularity and what it means when we are assembling a star schema data in Tableau and see how that actually plays out in reality. So remember that we define granularity as being the lowest level of gradation of data that is in each dimension in our star schema. This example has products, regions, times, and we noted that the lowest aggregation of data here we have is at the level of week. So if we wanted to drill down to the daily level, we would not be able to do it with this particular star. So the example that I was giving here had a sales fact table, it had a date dimension, it had a product dimension, and it had a store dimension. So if we apply the same process of analysis here, we can see that calendar date is the lowest level of gradation here. We can see that product name is the lowest level of gradation here. And we can see that store name is the lowest level of gradation here. And we have a district which is at a level higher than a store. Then in our fact table, we have three measures: the quantity sold, the unit cost, and the total sales. And these are key fields that allow us to link together the dimension tables and the fact table. So store key lines up with store key. I could highlight those in a different color here in Excel just to illustrate that. So store key matches up with store key, etc., etc. Now I'm looking at Tableau and I'm opening up a Microsoft Excel file as my source file. And here's my sales for class that we were looking at. And so I started by dragging in the sales fact table, which is at the middle of the star. Then I had the date dimension. I had the product dimension. And I had the store dimension. So I'm looking at the star here, and before I click on sheet 1, I want to see what's happening when I join the data together. So I'm going to go back to the Excel sheet, and here I have the sales fact table. And so what happens when a join is just like a VLOOKUP command, as I mentioned. And I'm going to say equals VLOOKUP. And then I'll say the store key. So look up the store key in the store dimension. I'll grab that entire range. Hit F4 to freeze the range reference, comma, second column, comma, false, enter. And now I've looked up the name of the store and I can just copy that down. So essentially what we've done, you can see all the data here for each store. I've added the store name to this as if it's a different second column. So joining the data in Tableau is similar to what I would do is if I took every single field that I wanted to add to this data so that I could search and qualify and do pivot table by doing a series of VLOOKUP commands. I would have to do numerous columns in order to do all the VLOOKUP commands to get all the data. So for example, here I would have to say freeze this A2. I would have to move this over again. Then I would have to, let's say, take that to be column 4. That would give me the district for all of them. Then I would have to do the same thing for products and for dates. So it would probably take me a good 5 or 10 minutes in order to set this up until I had all the data assembled in one sheet. Before then I could analyze all of it together. And I'm sure that you've done that many times when you've had to analyze data. But instead, let's go back to Tableau. With one click on sheet 1, I've assembled the entire star, and here it is. And you can see that each dimension is still recognized as a dimension, and that's because the source data came from different tabs in the spreadsheet. And then I noted that each item that is numeric or continuous is put as a measure, even though these reference, price per unit, and unit costs are actually dimensions. So I right-clicked on those and I said convert to dimension to move them up here. And now they're discrete data items. Their color is blue instead of green, although the underlying data type is still numeric, so you can still use them in numeric calculations if you want to. And so here are our three measures that we're going to be analyzing in this star. So what is the granularity of the data that I've just put in this star? Let's go back and look at our definition again, the finest gradation of data in each dimension. And how can I find that out in Tableau? Go back to Tableau, and if I drag over the number of records here, I'll see that it tells me that there are 321 records that I've imported. So if I end up with a table that has 321 rows in it, then I know that I'm at the lowest level of granularity. So let's go back. You can always go backwards in Tableau with the backwards arrow here. So let's bring in all of our key fields. If I bring in the date key, and then I bring in the product key, and then I bring in the store key, and I've told you before that those are the three elements that make up our granularity. I can already see down here in the lower left corner that I have 321 marks. That means I have 321 rows in this table, and so this is the lowest level of granularity. When I remove the store key, I'm now aggregating data. So for example, if I put total sales in here, I'm aggregating up to the level of date and product. Notice that I now only have 146 marks, so I've aggregated. If I take the date key out, and now I have all my sales by product, I'm down to just 5 marks, so I have a very large level of aggregation. So make sure that you understand what's the difference between the lowest level of granularity and what happens when you actually aggregate data up to higher levels of aggregation. I also mentioned the idea of having a hierarchy, and here we had a brand description and we had a category description. In the data that I have as my example here, where's the hierarchy? I have a store and I have a district. So right now I'm showing you the sales by product key, and I can easily bring in the product name instead. Just put that right on top there to switch that over. Expand this out so we can see the whole name there. And then, so there's product name. I want to see what store those were sold in, so I could add store, and then I could add district name above that. So here's our district, our store, and our product. Next, let's tackle the question of additive versus non-additive measures. So an additive measure is simply a number that can be added up, something like a dollar sales amount. It's a integer, or it is a real number. It is not a ratio. So when we add the values together, we get something that's still a valid number once the addition has taken place. If we go back and look at our Tableau here, right now, if I take out the product name, I'm adding up my sales to a higher level of aggregation, and these are in fact the correct numbers. If I break it back down to the individual numbers, I add them up manually. You could verify that those are the correct numbers. By the way, in order to make this into dollars, since we're dealing with a total sales, I can right click on this value here, measure here, and I can say default properties, number format, and then I can say currency standard, and then that will always be represented as a dollar. Now I want to define a ratio so we can see what happens when we are working with a non-additive measure. So the ratio that I want to show you is the margin percentage. So we'll start by defining the margin, and then we will define the margin percentage as the margin, which is the amount of profit divided by the dollar sales amount. So it's essentially the percentage of profit that we're getting on each sale. So I'll go back to my Tableau. I can clear off this worksheet by simply hitting the X up here, so I'm starting over again. I'm going to go back up to Analysis and say Create Calculated Field. I'm going to call this Margin, and then I'll just drag in the values that I need over here. So margin is equal to the total sales minus the quantity sold times the number of times the unit cost. And notice Tableau tells us that's a valid calculation, and so I can click OK. And I also know that margin is in dollars, so I'm going to say default property, change that number format, and make that into currency. So now if I want to see, for example, margin by store, I can just drag that over. There we go. Margin by store. Next, I'm going to define margin percentage, and I'll start by defining it so that it is operating at the level of each individual row in the data. So I'm going to say Analysis, Create Calculated Field, call this margin percentage row. And I'm simply going to take the margin that we just calculated here and I'm going to divide that by the total sales. And you'll see that Tableau tells us that's a valid calculation. I can say OK. I'll right click on that, say default properties, number format, and call that a percentage. So what happens if I put this margin percentage row at this level of aggregation? You want to bet that it's going to be wrong? If you do, you will be correct that it is wrong. But why would it be wrong? Let's go back to the Excel sheet for a second here. So notice here I have each row of data. And so what would the margin be for this row? It would be, let's see, equals, first of all, the total sales minus the unit cost times the quantity sold. So there's our margin for that row. And what's our margin percentage? Equals 1708 divided by the total sales. And then let's change this to a percentage here. So that's actually how I would do the calculation in Excel. And if I were doing it for each row, I would then copy that down. So there we go. We've got the margin percentage for every single row. Would it be right to sum this up? If I said equal sum here for this entire thing here, we would get a ridiculous number of 10,000%. So obviously that's not correct. We could take the average, and if we do that, and we're going to get an average of 31%. So on each individual sale that we have in each store across all of our stores, we have a margin of 31%. But given the fact that we have different number of units sold on each line, some of these lines that have a large amount of sales will distort the calculations versus the ones that have a small amount, or vice versa. And what we really would like to know is what is the overall margin. So if I go to the bottom here and say, okay, instead let's take our total margin, so that equals the sum of everything that we've got here, and then let's take what is, let's see, that's the margin. I need the sum of the total sales equals sum. Let's see, where's my total sales row up here? Get that. And I don't want that to be a percentage. I want that to be a number. And then I will simply take our margin divided by our total sales, and let's make that into a percentage. And there we go. Our actual margin percentage for all of our sales combined together is 41.5%. So let's see what we get in Tableau if we do exactly the same calculations. Okay, I'm back in Tableau. I'm going to clear my worksheet here. First thing I'll do is I'm going to get all the data at the lowest level of granularity here. So date, product, and store. So now I've got 321 marks. So let's bring in the margin for each of those sales, and then let's bring in the margin percentage. Okay, so this should look essentially exactly like what I just showed you over here. If I go to in Excel, if I go to analysis and I say totals and I say show column grand totals, let's see what I have here at the bottom. Yep, looks like that's exactly the erroneous 10,000% that I got before. And my 16,000 is the margin. Now that's correct because that's an additive measure, but this is incorrect because a ratio is not an additive measure. Tableau does have a way of changing this to an average. I can say analysis, totals, total all using, and change that to average. And now I get the 31.7% that I showed you in Excel. So the trick to defining the ratio correctly so it will aggregate properly is to add a certain operator in the calculated field. And I'm going to show that to you what it is. I'm going to say create calculated field, and I'll call this margin percentage, and just leave it at that because this is the correct one. And then I'm going to say sum. So sum is an operator that tells Tableau to do exactly what you think it does, which is to sum up whatever numbers are in this bracket here. So I'm going to say sum my margin, put that in between the brackets, and then I will say sum. I always start off with a bracket and move my cursor in the middle and then just drag this in, sum of total sales. And so it again tells us the calculation is valid. So remember what our previous one just said, margin divided by total sales. This says sum up the margins first, then sum up the total sales, then take the division, and that will give us the margin percentage. Remember what we did in Excel. I summed up the column of the margin, I summed up the column of total sales, then I took the division, and I got the overall number. So we're telling Tableau to do exactly what we would have done in Excel. And here's Tableau again. I'm going to click on OK. Since this is a percentage, I'm going to change that default properties to number format percentage. OK, and then I'm going to drag this onto my table. And you're going to see that when we were at the level of aggregation of each individual row, we have exactly the same numbers. However, I believe that we look at the grand total here. We make sure that we're looking at the right one. Up here, let's expand this column here. Here's the real one. Here's the old one. So the real one went in the middle here. By the way, you can change the order of the columns by changing the order of these things which are called pills. These are measure values over here. And the measure values shelf, this is called a shelf, is telling you what's actually in the Tableau. So notice that at the bottom here, when it takes the overall, I get the 41.46% that I got in Excel. So what happens if I take away one level of aggregation, or of granularity, and move up in aggregation? I'll take the stores out. So I'm now looking at product by date, and you can see that the overall margin percentage is still exactly the same. But on the individual lines, so for date the 28th of the month, product 1, I had a total margin of 37.56. This was a margin percentage of 25.6%. And probably because I only had one sale on that day, this is still the same number here. But let's take out the date key and just look by product. So here I have product 1, we had $2,500 of margin, a margin percentage of 36%. But now that we've aggregated at that highest level, our incorrect calculation would say a margin of 21,000%. Before I finish, I want to make one more note, and remember that this margin percentage row here that I'm saying is incorrect. It is incorrect because we're taking the sum here. When you move a measure onto the Tableau, Tableau automatically assumes that you want to sum it up, because this is called the data table here level, or the table level that you're looking at, and it automatically assumes that you're going to want to do something like take the sum or take the average. So you can change what Tableau is doing here by saying sum, and then saying measure, and then saying average. And so when I do that, I just got the average margin. So that would be the average margin for each transaction for that particular product. Let me go back and change that to the sum. Let's say I take the average of the margin percentage though. So I say this one here, measure, average. So now I can compare. Overall, my margin percentage for product number 1 was 36.9%. But when I look at a row by row basis, I actually have a margin percentage of 30.4%. So both of these are valid calculations, but we have to understand exactly what we're getting. This is the weighted average, and this is the average for each individual row of transaction. So even though it sounds simple when I'm talking about it right now, in fact, many people get tripped up because they do not understand what granularity is, what aggregation is, and the necessity of using the sum operator, so that you first sum up the left-hand side and then the right-hand side of a calculation, deferring the division until you get up to whatever level of aggregation you want. So this is a basic thing to understand about Tableau. You probably understand it quite well if you're doing it in Excel. So just translate your Excel knowledge into Tableau.